Well, hello there. I'm Chris from Airwindows, and here is my Monday stream once more. Let me switch back over to web and such. I've got our chat up and live. I've got paper to draw stuff on and a pen to draw stuff with. So basically, oh, and I have my coffee, second cup of coffee today. So I am all set to do another live stream. And let me see. Yep, I've been moving the camera around a little bit. I've got it sitting back a little bit so that I'm not up in the cameras too much. And I've actually been doing a lot of work on lighting and stuff too. Specifically, while people aren't here chatting, and presumably I'm still rocking this, I can quickly check by playing audio there. And somebody is here, so hello. One thing I can do is show you some of what I've been doing if I am clever about it. So this is going to look a little strange. Don't get too dizzy as I move the camera thingy around. See, this is what the world looked like to me when I'm making these videos. Namely, there's a bunch of big lights, and you can see in the mirror here, because there's partly for acoustic reasons, there's a sort of panel of mirrors in the corner of my room. If you look carefully, you can see the back of that light, and it's up on a sort of structure of drum things. In fact, maybe I can get a weird angle on this. There you can see the way that this is kind of hung up on some drum rack mount tubing. And then also, there is that incredibly bright light there, which is hiding behind this light here. And it's pointing at the mirror there and reflecting at me, so it bounces off of that mirror and reflects in my eyes. But I've also got another tweak here. I'm going to have a really hoarse day today, I guess. You can kind of see up at the top there, that is a mirror bolted to the wall. And the reason it's there doing that is because if I have that little bitty light bulb facing the opposite direction, it goes to the guitars and reflects off of shiny things and bright stuff on the guitars. So I've had to choose between those two situations. And excuse me for half a moment. Yeah. Hopefully my voice won't become a complete wreck. I'm not really quite sure why it's doing that. I guess you gotta take what you find, as it were, because I don't get to not have my voice go hoarse on me necessarily. Not only that, I'm going to be using it for 2 solid hours, so I might go real hoarse by the end of the live stream. And so far I haven't cleared $1,500 on the Patreon, so I will not be doing another live stream on Wednesday unless I hit that goal by Wednesday, I suppose, which is possible. So that's the thing where I'll start doing a detailed analysis of a vinyl record. And now that I mention it, one thing I could do is experiment with something. So bear with me because I'm going to play a little game here. We're going to take a moment and I'm back. I'm shutting off this. And I'm going to have a excuse me for a moment. Nobody is using the chat just yet, so we're going to briefly mute that so I can see what audio input capture is doing. And I'll go back to that and add this. So now I have a whole little bank of stuff in OBS here. And one of them is getting computer audio, but the other one is called game audio capture. And I don't know whether I'm going to be able to hear this, but it'll do this. Way on down south, London town. Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. So just in case that becomes useful in future, although I'm clearly going to have to work out a way of monitoring it, perhaps I'll just play it over the speakers. Little tiny burst of essentially good quality vinyl record capture. This is my fancy turntable, or fancy-ish turntable. Well, because I built it myself, and a counterpoint phono preamp. And the turntable looks kind of like this. That strange sausage-like thing is a styrofoam tone arm with an aluminum outer shell. It's inspired by some very high-cost technology. Back in the day, I was subscribing to Absolute Sound magazine and being an audiophile, and some of the phono things that they talked about were like that. Seeing as I'm not using it immediately, I'm going to shut that off. But I can add this audio capture. And that also means I can do other things such as now, the challenge there is I actually can't hear any of that. Yeah, it's a styrofoam aluminum composite. I forget the name of the tone arm that it was based on, but that's part of the thing. Is it was a improvised variation on a very expensive phono tone arm that you can get. One of the top of the line ones in the whole entire world was made in a very similar way. It's this sort of spacious structure, and I don't know whether it necessarily had foam on the inside, but it turns out to be a fairly decent way of absorbing sound or absorbing vibration. So yeah, there are all kinds of neat things that you can do with stuff like that. And as you can see, I like building things from out of nothing, or just improvising stuff. And that tone arm, which you briefly heard, hopefully a tiny snippet of this album, is not going to get me whacked off of YouTube. Although I suppose I'll find out. If the stream goes dead, then somebody went and found it. And people can say in chat, like, "Oh no, your stream has died." And I'll have to guess, I'll start it again or something. But that means that the Wednesday ones technically could play little snippets of audio. The challenge there being that the way I've got it set up, I can't hear them. So that'll be interesting. Unless, of course, no. Don't mind me, I'm brainstorming. I'm thinking of things on the fly as we go, which is sometimes what we do. And although I like the fact that I can run the audio of the turntable through my desk as I do, and capture it directly and send it on the stream, it may or may not be something that I'm actively doing, because I'd kind of need to be able to hear it. And yeah, maybe you are the only one here, Bo, which is fine. It doesn't have to be a hop in scene every single time. Maybe everybody is playing with Dekraka, which I just put out the other day. It was kind of funny because it's like I did not anticipate that going over as positively or being recognized for what it is, but apparently it did go over fairly well. So that's pretty cool. I've been doing a lot of building and fixing things at the moment, because what with like the estate arrangements for my folks from last year and all that kind of stuff, a whole bunch of things have come into my world and needing to be sorted out. For instance, I can show you one of them because it's within arm's reach. This is a table, and the neat thing about it is it was my grandmother's table in her house in Northampton, which I took care of at one point because she passed away, or actually she moved to a nursing home and then passed away, and it's a bit of a dark story, but it was my job to clean it up, and this was before I had actually gotten clean myself, so I spent a bunch of time drinking incredibly strong coffee and smoking pot in my grandmother's house, and in theory, like cleaning all of the walls and tidying everything up and stuff, which I wasn't doing a very good job of because I didn't start actually becoming productive and doing any of the things I cared about until I got clean. But this was here. This table was on in sort of the sunroom by the side of her favorite chair. And I have a uncle who lives in a house in Wellesley with much fancy fine furniture and stuff like that. And they were interested in certain things like a grandfather clock that my folks had, but never got interested in this. And I think the reason is fairly direct. It's heavily worn. So, sadly, and I think it is a little bit sad, although I'm not gonna judge because people live in the style in which they live. But this sort of family heirloom thing is also kind of dirty and shabby and stuff. But at the same time, this is like all funky and carved up and such, and is actually a mahogany table. So you could, in theory, make a guitar out of it, but I don't intend to, because the thing is, I like it for what it is. It is actually a solid as heck table, and all of these funny little carved places and things are intact and as sturdy as ever. This is the farthest string from like IKEA, or there's no particle board here. So it's this incredibly sturdy little table, and I just took a liking to it. So rather than let it go into a dumpster, which is what would have happened to it, I was like, I'm going to take this home and find a place for it, which is what I have done. And there's been a certain amount of stuff like that. And that kind of touches on some of the things, that I care about. Namely, like with the making that turntable tone arm. And it's a concept that I did a sort of low-rent DIY version of. I think it's worth understanding what things actually are or making things be what they actually are without too much distraction by, how pretty are they, how trendy are they. And obviously my plugin stuff has always flown that banner, because I've made a point of it being very direct and functional, to where people have often tuned it out and not paid any attention until I got stuff that made a good enough sound that it would distract from the tacky appearance, or whatever you might call it. I do still hope to start putting in some time and energy learning how to do VST graphics, and I may or may not be able to also include Apple Coco audio unit graphics. And it may, because the thing about when you start including that, it becomes really challenging and kind of dangerous, because that's the area that starts breaking on you fastest, I think. I think that's how that basically works. Is the audio is a fairly simple interface and doesn't change around much. But then when you start doing things, especially if they're like funky things, VST, I believe, has a pretty direct visual interface and just does it in a fairly primitive sense. Audio units, on the other hand, and I've experimented with this before, which people wouldn't really know because nothing has come from it, but I've experimented with this before. Audio units like to run on what's called a Coco infrastructure, you might say. And this Coco infrastructure is challenging enough that some very good developers have found it daunting. Which is not to say that it's impossible to use, just that it's one of those things kind of like doing fancy programming for VSTs, where people would find it challenging because Steinberg would just be doing whatever their weird thing was, and not really terribly communicative. There is often a tendency among skilled programmers to go, oh, this is self-documenting. I've developed this method of interpreting the graphics in this thing, and I thought it out so well, and it is so perfect that nobody needs to be told how to use it, and nobody would ever do anything different or choose to do anything in any other way. This is the only way to do the thing. And of course, this is arrogance in action when people carry on that way, but it's very common all the same. People will often carry on that way, and the stuff that they're doing will be kind of arcane and weird, but it won't seem weird to them because they're the ones that thought it up. This is one reason why when I do programming, I like to keep stuff very simple and direct. And often the code that I write might not even be the most efficient, but it is the most primitive to read. I'm not alone there. There's other people, like the game programmer Jonathan Blow has given talks about this, and had a sort of come to Jesus moment around that concept, inspired by the game programmer John Carmack, famously of Doom and Quake and such. And here, just a moment, I'm going to have a look at the dashboard. Yep, there are some people here, and presumably inspired by the game programmer John Carmack. Maybe I'm still making a sound? I would imagine if you couldn't hear me... Oh, no, wait, just a moment, I'm assuming that if you couldn't hear me, somebody would have chattered something. Like right now, it's showing the mic aux still going, but at the same time, if... Oh, wait, I know what's happening. Oh, yep. Don't mind me, I'm figuring things out. Or failing to figure things out. I shut off my speakers for the monitor speakers. And right now, if I was to play YouTube and unmute it, it would be coming through the speakers, except for right now those are muted, so I can't hear it. So I thought maybe my sound had gone dead, and it has not. Yeah. Gosh, what was I talking about? More coffee, salvation of all brain ills. There are going to be some weeks where I am more lively than others. And this week, after having put out Deck Recca, I'm kind of at a loss for rants and thoughts and things. Like, I don't want to sit around complaining about stuff, but, my voice is a little hoarse, and I... distracted. Yeah, John Carmack. Chris Herb has mentioned that. Yeah, which brings me back to what I was talking about. That is the train of thought. I will tend to write code in a way that is just very directly doing things in sequence, rather than having stuff call other routines and have it be sort of interrelated. That kind of thing where it's like, and this calls this, which does this 10,000 times in this loop, and then it also calls upon this subroutine over here, which does the other thing. And you wind up having a very complicated program that looks like it's only about 5 lines of code, each in 5 different places. And then in functionality, it's the same as having 50,000 lines of code, but you don't see any of that, because it's just this complicated rigmarole, a complicated machine of code that calls other code and very interrelated stuff. I tend to write my stuff very directly, which does not necessarily make it more efficient. But it does make it more primitive, and I still consider that to be a valuable thing in its way. It means that everything is sort of on the surface. Like, there's a directness to it that is easily lost when you start getting sophisticated. Now, where that gets interesting is touching upon stuff like the way more sophisticated programmers do their code. For instance, my brother, who helped me set up the VSTs, and we got fairly far, although it ended up having to get help from certain people, notably Giancarlo, who is the guy behind Nebula. And Giancarlo helped me when I was trying to get the VST stuff together, which is notable because very few people, it seems, will do that. I have found that maybe because it's the music business, but I think it's probably the same in game developing, is that people will very often, maybe not so much in game developing because it demands more skill for game developing, but you will often get people kind of sitting on their property or sitting upon what they know about, and then not necessarily sharing the information, which is why I push the open source stuff so hard, is because I think it's valuable for people to pass on their information, their ability to do stuff, more than you'll sometimes see. Or maybe it's just me being a loser and having no friends, and so I don't have the ability to hang out with coders who can show me how to do some of these things. I think, honestly, that software plugin coders are a fairly isolated breed, though. So it's probably not all down to me being a loser and having no friends. Maybe some of it. I don't know. You guys are my friends. As I watch the viewership tumble down to zero, it's like, no, we're not your friend. We're going away. So here's the question. Is sometimes I feel maybe folks are waiting on me and expecting to follow my train of thought, and there ain't necessarily a train of thought. I can make notes with the pen and I can draw stuff, but I'm also here to answer questions, and will tirelessly go back over stuff if people want to hear it. So I'm going to throw it out to the chat, which has a few people in it at the moment, and say, is there anything that you want me to answer or explain or talk about that would be convenient? Because we got like an hour and a half, and I am at your disposal. I am setting aside some time today before going off and doing whatever else it is I got going on today. And there's a number of possibilities there, but for now, and it's like, if people don't actually have questions but just want to hang out, oh, hey, Bo is rebooting the computer. By all means, do that. You know, if people just want to hang out, one thing that they could do is I could throw on some other live streams, perhaps at different times, and just like play games or something and talk during that, which would be turning myself into literally a YouTuber. Kind of a horrifying thought, but stranger things have happened, so we shall see. But in the absence of that, you'll have my full attention, and we'll see what we can do. Hopefully OBS can handle all that kind of stuff. I do have some plans towards trying to enhance that kind of thing so that I could do anything like that. Do like, you know, hey, and it's Chris from Airwindows in Minecraft building things or whatever. Being a coder, one thing I'm able to do with that is run servers of my own and code plugins for them. And plugins in Minecraft do very different things from plugins in audio programs, but many of the principles are still the same. Like I have a series of Minecraft plugins for doing interesting stuff, and could be coding the plugins, and sort of that's done in Java, and I'm not super swift on Java, but if I have a start on it, then I can generally run from there. Or it can be just a hanging out kind of thing. Remains to be seen. I honestly really don't know. Today feels a little bit like a I don't know, chilling out kind of day. There's a number of, let me see, what was I thinking? I was going to try something. Hey, Bo. Bo is back. Chris has a question. Cool. So, the math behind meters in DAW showing higher levels when working a 96K sample rate, that sounds like that would depend upon the frequencies that you're using. Like, a meter that is working correctly should be showing the same setting if the samples are the same. So this might be worth me drawing up some notes. Hey, fam. I'm guessing, and I'm not sure exactly what meters you mean, but suppose you got a waveform, and the waveform is over a position of 0. So you're trying to measure this. And if you were doing like 44.1K, you're reconstructing this waveform through samples at these positions. That doesn't mean you're recording the sound at those positions. It means you're making up a set of samples with the intention that the resulting wave will reconstruct it. Okay, now you've surprised me, because I would not guess that Voxengo spam would show higher levels just because it's being run at a different sample rate. I use Voxengo spam myself, and I've never really thought that it was. I guess it would depend upon what you mean by that. Like, is it no longer lining up with what the DAW is telling you level-wise? Because the thing about it is, here, I should switch this around so that I'm using a finer grained line, because that's kind of the point of the exercise here. The finer grained line also implies a finer resolution of sampling, which is literally what we're talking about. Oh, yeah, I know I actually am a Patreon supporter of the dude from Snake Oil, because I just kind of liked his style and what he was doing. He seemed to like my tape-to-tape plugin, and I'm still waiting on whether he finds some of my stranger exploits to be crazy snake oil or not. I'm more than happy to find out. You know, he is welcome to have whatever opinion he likes, but I'm sure there are other people that are more interesting to him. He doesn't need anything more from me. I'm literally paying him. So here we have a waveform with, say, 44.1K sample rate. This is going to be a pretty high frequency waveform. And then this would be something like 192K or even more. It's certainly higher than 96K. Call it 192K. So basically, what's going on is if you were recording like 8 samples and averaging them out to show what a RMS value is, and the frequency is low enough that it's just a continuous stretch, it won't matter whether your 8 samples are at 44.1K or at 192K. And that's assuming that it is just naively taking 8 adjacent samples. Now, I can't believe that Voxengo spam would actually be doing that, because they're doing FFT fast Fourier transform analysis, meaning that it'll bust it down into like 16,386 different bins with a mathematical algorithm, given a certain buffer of stuff to measure. And it'll analyze what frequencies are in what bin and give you those numbers on the output. That shouldn't be affected by the sample rate, because you'll have to process more samples at the higher rate, but the algorithm gives you frequencies. So I guess I'm confused as to, did he? He can have a conversation with me as long as he can video stream. As you can see, I can video stream, so have him talk to me. Dude, if you're watching, or if you go and look at this, here, point him to this video and tell him what the timestamp is. if you're watching, I would be more than happy to collaborate with you. It's probably better to do that than have you reviewing my stuff, because I'm now your Patreon supporter, so that would be kind of conflict of interest. Like, you could treat me nicely, but then everybody would wonder whether you were just being bribed to do so because I was your patron. So, not at very much. It's like $1 a month or something, but that does count. That does matter. Anyways, this higher levels thing, you've basically gobsmacked me as far as the Voxengo span is concerned, because I am not used to the idea that that would misbehave. That should be giving the same level. However, if you were measuring a sound that is like maybe white noise or maybe like hi-hats or something, cymbal crashes, and you have the 192K or 96K, then that should be producing a louder sound than if you just had 44.1K, simply because there's going to be content that is higher than the Nyquist value, the cutoff value of 22.050K. That is the spectrum analyzer should be showing more stuff on the high frequencies if it exists, because using the lower sample rate will literally will filter out stuff over a certain frequency. So, my other question is, what is the duration of your sound? And I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's flip this over so that I have a little more space to run. Suppose this is a bit of waveform, and it's just this kind of spike. It is an audio thing happening. If you have a spectrum analyzer, and your analyzer is averaging like 16 samples, I don't know that this is necessarily the case, but it would be a possible explanation. If you're averaging 16 samples in order to get the spectrum analysis at a certain frequency, then this is going to include a lot of blank stuff over here, so it'll be a resulting lower level. Whereas if your 16 samples are all in here, then that's going to be a higher level, because the averaging that's being done, and this might pertain to the setting you've got on it. I have no idea what Snakeoil's phone number is. Maybe rather than looking at average, you're looking at persistent values. That could give you different results based on where the samples are being averaged and how that's working. Because I'm just trying to figure out how this would be happening, because it shouldn't be. Differences between these kinds of measurements should not be giving you different amplitude results. You know, and I'm familiar enough with Voxengo span that I would assume that it was beyond reproach. That I would assume that it was perfect and fine, because the guy seems to know what he's doing. So I'm assuming that what you're responding to is, rather than having the measurements of the spectrum, well, hang on. There's another possible explanation. You see, if you are dividing up a frequency spectrum, say like that, and you're dividing it into this many bands, like that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Suppose you're measuring that in such a way that you're doing your frequency out the spectrum analyzer, and your overall sound is peaking out at 0 dB. These individual bins are not going to peak out at 0 dB. They're going to be smaller. They're going to go up to like yay much for this entire range, yay much for this entire range. Now, supposing, and this is something that you could also switch back and forth, maybe it'll become enlightening. We're using many more bins in the FFT analysis. So instead, it's looking at these individual things. The granularity of what you're measuring is much finer. Sometimes this means it can react faster. I think it depends upon how the FFT algorithm works. But you're looking at just one of these bins rather than this larger area. It's now divided into about 16, 32, even 64 individual places to look at. Each of those are going to return a value. And the value of each of those could be a lot lower simply because they add up to the higher value, and then the whole thing adds up to this higher value up here. But the more bins you divide it into, the smaller each of them is going to be. It's kind of like having a mix and going, how loud is my mix? It's peaking out at like -3 dB full scale. And I have one track. That track is going to be -3. Then if you have like, I'm peaking out at -3 full scale and I have 675 tracks, they're all going to be way lower than -3 because they add up to it. And that might be what you're seeing regarding 44 and 96 in the spectrum analyzer. I'm not sure of that because that would imply that it's using more bins to go to 96. On the other hand, it might be because the thing about it is more paper. Yay. Let's assume that your audio is band limited. So the thing that you're recording is like this, or maybe it tapers off a little bit more. And here is your Nyquist limit. And it's not generating a lot of sound over 20K. It's not like generating a lot of sound way high up like that. Oh, also, Snake Oil Dude does not live in America, so it's not noon for him. So bear in mind, always try to remember this kind of thing. The reason I chose 11 o'clock is because there's a lot of people in North America who can handle that, because it's going to be like wee hours of the morning, or it's going to be around noon. And for people in the UK, and I've got a bunch of people who use my plugins in London, apparently, which is rather cool. Maybe I can go there sometime and visit them. But there's a lot of people in London who use my plugins, and for them it's like, 6 or something in the evening, so it's still possible to tune in. Snake Oil Guy is not there, so for him this might be like the middle of the night or something terrible like that. Hard to tell. But it's worth bearing in mind, because this is like a world-based society. It's late afternoon. That's what I thought. There were some cartoonists that I was following and paying attention to who were talking about what time to do Twitter posts and things. And they were breaking it down by time, and they were like, yep, around 11 o'clock in the morning, and that's when everybody can be at least aware of what you're doing. So, is he in Holland? He could be in Holland. Oh, you're in the Netherlands. Cool. So, yeah, it may or may not be an appropriate time for him. If it is, that's cool. That's kind of why I'm picking my time for live streaming the way that I am. If I ended up doing a game thing, which would be more recreational, that might be more along the lines of evening, which would mean that it would be like crazy wee hours of the night for people in the Netherlands. But getting back to the topic at hand, why would it be giving different results in the spectrum analyzer and have that be legitimate? Here's the thing. Say you've got these two boundaries. This is up to 44.1K sampling rate. So you are going to contain frequencies from 0 to 22 kilohertz. Then if you do 96K sampling rate, you do 0 to 44 kilohertz, or roughly. Actually, I think 96K is 48. So you're going to do things from that. If you have the same settings on the spectrum analyzer, here's what you're going to do. I'll go back to my smaller pen. Let's say you're using 8 bands. 2, 4, 8. You're looking at what's in these bins. Let's say you're at 96K. 2, 4. So, spectrum analysis is breaking the sound up into individual bins that are then shown relative to the full scale. What's going to happen, and I'm not exactly sure how this works out, but it could explain what's happening, is you're going to, and first of all, tell me, like, at the 96K, is the amplitude going down or up? Because I haven't tried this. I'd probably be able to figure it out, but I haven't tried that, so I don't know whether you switch to 96K and the volume shown on the spectrum analyzer goes down. Does it or does it not? Because I could potentially have the explanation for that. And rather than it being a mistake, it would be legitimate, but you'd have to incorporate it into your plans as far as how to measure things. Because essentially what's going on is a change in the width of your measurement. So here's what's going on in the absence of a clear answer. Hang on. Okay. Let's look at bin number, the bin that suits like lower mid-range. If you are measuring this stuff and you're switching to a higher sampling rate, the lower frequency stuff, the lower sampling rate stuff, is going to measure this, and it's this little area, so it's going to record whatever content is contained within that bin. If you simply switch it to a higher sampling rate without changing the size of the bins, you're now looking at this width for that area, and this plus the stuff that lives here means that the bin, say, we'll call this higher up, it seems to go up because rather than looking at the content in this section individually, you're now combining this section and this section. And since they're what we're showing here is a pretty flat frequency bandwidth, those are the same. So when you combine them into a single bin, they go up. I believe it's going to be 3 dB, 6 dB. Doubling it, I think, is 6 dB. That would be like bit shift gain. So there goes my YouTube. YouTube has now flagged me as being naughty because I said the words bit shift gain. I'm actually getting off easy. There is a Minecraft YouTuber called Mumbo Jumbo who's having a horrible time because a major record company is flagging all of his intro and outro music for no particular reason. So he has to challenge all of those one at a time. And he has the, oh my God, hey there, how's it going? Somebody has woken up Mr. White Sea. I need to remember your damn name. I'm one of your patrons, and so I should be remembering your damn name. Anyways, this is what's happening with this bandwidth thing. You might be getting higher showing on the frequency analyzer. I know, I do. Because it is counting more in the same range. So you might be able to get similar behavior by doubling the number of bins as you change the oh, for heaven's sake, I'm frustrated. Now I'm going to go on my Patreon, look at who I am actually supporting, and then go and look up dude's name, because he's not just Mr. White Sea. Dum-de-dum-de-dum. Oh, I'm on the public creator page. I can't even find it. He is also not Mr. Snake Oil. He's Mr. Anti-Snake Oil. Don't mind me. I'm looking at the Patreon section a little bit. I bet I can find it. My memberships. There we go. Nobody told me. I'm going to go and find out. I also like Do Not Eat, and I became a subscriber to WC Olo Garb as well, which gives me much pleasure. Oh, is that why you are using White Sea Studio? Is it's a riff on your name? That's cool. Okay. Yeah, WC Olo Garb is Jexus, so one of the things I'm going to try to do is bear in mind names. Names are a useful thing. I try to say people's names. In fact, I've gotten caught out on the stream by greeting somebody who showed up with the joke name, and they had me saying like, "I suck dicks," and I'm like, "Oh, hey, I suck dicks. How are you doing?" And oh, you got me. So not to leave this too suddenly, and very cool. Okay, so that's always interesting, learning why people name things the way that they do. I have recently found actually inherited book on Magritte's paintings, and it touches on my choice of Airwindows for kind of company name. Oh, hello, Julianne. A company name. Airwindows is kind of like the Magritte painting of the painting overlapping a window and showing exactly the same thing behind the window. It is the kind of thing where the idea from Airwindows is if speakers are a window upon the sound, I want to be able to do stuff that is like you broke the window and you can reach or step right through and be in the place where that you're listening to. You can reach out and touch the thing that you're trying to record. And getting digital stuff to do that is a bear, let me tell you. So hopefully that will explain what's happening with the spectrum analyzer. If I'm not mistaken, that's the explanation. And the whole reason is that if you're recording stuff and listening to the spectrum analysis or looking at the spectrum analysis at 44.1K, most of your audio content is going to fit within that. If you're doing it at 96K, a bunch of this is going to mostly not be used by audio. And if the spectrum analyzer is recording, this is the proportion of what was in this bin, then it will go up because there's more stuff combined into that one bin. To fix it, you would have to go to double the number of bins, which is another one of the settings. And that would probably make it go back again. I'm not absolutely certain, but that would probably make it go back again. I believe that is as much of an explanation as you're going to get, or at least as much of an explanation as I'm able to give for now. So let me scroll up and find out, like, why were we even talking about waking up this poor guy and getting him to go here. Oh, because you were looking for digital distortion and decapitated review, starting a discussion. I'm at your disposal. What do you want to know? I know some of these things, so it's possible I'll be able to explain it on pieces of paper for you as you watch. It is certainly worth trying. We got another hour and 5 minutes to go. So before dinner time, I can, well, there's no reason not to. I mean, I'm more than happy to pitch in and help. It's kind of what I do. I even still have a little bit of coffee in case it turns out to be intellectually challenging. But go ahead and ask. There's no reason to not throw lots of questions, because otherwise I'm just sort of sitting there seeing whether I can get people to ask me anything or whatever. So I'm looking for Bo's question, and Whitesy, if you've got any specifics around what you're looking for. And let me see, scroll up again. Digital distortion. See, I don't know what you mean by that. I haven't seen that review yet. I will certainly have a look, but I haven't seen that review yet. Well, it's kind of like a video. I don't know. Do you have a video feed that I can bring up on stream? It's a bit of a commute. Granted, the area that I'm in, which is Vermont in the United States, can be as cold as like Scandinavia or whatever. Not that Holland is Scandinavia at all. But the thing about it is, Google Hangouts sometimes work. We can organize something. I am at your disposal. Basically, I just have to schedule things. So I'm here on Monday answering questions, and Tuesday I pay no attention to anybody on the internet, and I'm jamming on synthesizers for 2 hours. And when I reach a certain level, I'm going to be doing analysis of record albums and showing graphics and things on that on Wednesdays, also at 11 o'clock in the morning. But basically, whatever I do, either I schedule it or it doesn't get done. So Bo has the question. Is there an additional waveform that speakers like? Technically, what speakers would like best is silence, because anything else makes them do work. That's kind of the bottom line. However, square waves, that's actually a really good and a really deep question, Whitesy. So, and it might tie in to the other question. Like the thing about analog square waves, and I can actually guess. So here's some experimentation that you can do, Whitesy, with some of this stuff. I've done it. There is also a notable thread on the forum Gearsluts, which is worth paying attention to because it's like eBay is the online marketplace thing for good or ill, and Amazon is online store for good or ill. Gearsluts is kind of online plugin mongers and music equipment people forum for good or ill, and everything else is kind of less traveled, more personal, more specialized. So here's what the deal is with, and there's a reason why my tape simulation and the distortion in it mostly has the depth. You would be able to put in audio into my tape simulation that would break it and make it sound digital again. You're probably not putting the right content into it to fully get the to make it fail, in other words. And here's the idea of so we're talking about harmonics here. That's going to be the key to understanding this, is harmonics. Suppose you have a waveform and it's like a triangle waveform. So there's an edge on here, there's a corner, but mostly it's not all that demanding. Like a square wave is super demanding, and I'll show you how. But a triangle wave, those harmonics are going to fall away. The fundamental tone is much louder than the high frequency stuff. Now YouTube's going to think I'm drawing dirty pictures because well, anyway, onwards. You got to have some fun with this sort of thing as well. So if you have a waveform like this, it is going to have diminishing harmonic volumes. The harmonics are less. I'm not sure there is any ideal waveform for limiters. You could say that a square wave is the ultimate thing for distortion or limiters because in theory it does not change. A perfect square wave is going to have too much bandwidth for anything, no matter what, in digital form. So it wouldn't actually alter in any way to change it that way. As you start distorting waveforms, putting them into distortion so that there's a flat top on them, you start getting harmonics that are like this, and then they will fall off. It'll start getting steeper rather than having harmonics go away. You're producing new harmonics as you clip stuff, as you make it closer and closer to full-on square wave. Like we're talking analog square wave. Like a decent synthesizer can produce this waveform pretty easily. In fact, you can produce this waveform from simple CMOS chips, and I'm hoping to get into more of the modular synthesizer DIY stuff of building oscillators and things from this kind of stuff. But the easiest thing to make is a oscillator that just generates a square wave, because there's circuits that can go, okay, we're this until the capacitor reaches a certain point and then it flips to the other side. Now we're at this extreme. And it can do that with a switch speed that's extremely high. That relates to slew rate, actually, because everything is going to have limitations. Like if you're doing your analog square wave and you're running through certain kinds of chips that exist in analog circuitry, certain op-amps and things, they can't switch that quickly, so they wind up putting this slanty part in. And that makes a lot of things easier to handle. It changes the tone of whatever it is that you're doing, that the circuit can't switch from one position to the other that fast. The slew rate is part of what my software is about, and I do a fair amount of stuff like that. So here's where things start getting interesting with regard to digital. Supposing we have our signal, let's say it's just a sine wave. A sine wave is like single harmonic, no other harmonics. And you start distorting it. If you distort it real gently, like the top doesn't just clip. If the top clipped, you'd start seeing a line of harmonics that would get louder and louder way down here. But if the algorithm you're using, which is what I'm using into tape, is something like a sine wave curve, it starts smoothing over very gradually. There are no sharp corners to that. And what that means is you start pushing it and you start getting one harmonic after another added. Like this gets louder, and then you get one over here, and this starts getting louder. And if you had if this frequency was up here, and there was still room to do these two over here at the same levels, as long as it doesn't go past this point, which is the Nyquist frequency, you don't have any aliasing distortion. Now I'm going to show you what aliasing is. I freaked out this thread on Gearsluts about it. Here's what happens when you start distorting it so much that we're generating all of these harmonics. Also notice that these are pretty evenly spaced. I'm going to have them start going down a little bit. Supposing we're generating so many harmonics, we're distorting the sine wave so hard that it's showing this shape. And here's your Nyquist frequency, and we're doing this digitally. We're doing this in the box. And we've added so much distortion, and this can be done with saturations. It can be done with just straight up digital distortion. It can be done with compressors reacting so quickly that, like, the waveform going up hits the threshold point and is forced to turn down so quickly that there is this sharp corner in the waveform that it generates. Anything that causes information that has a sharpness of where the waveform turns a corner, if the corner it turns is sharper than a certain frequency, that's beyond the Nyquist frequency. You start getting this. You expect that we're going to go that's what we're supposed to get. You can't see it right now, but we're supposed to have this. But guess what? In digital, we can't have that. We can't have nice things because digital can handle stuff beyond the Nyquist frequency. Like if you try to record it, you won't get it. It will filter it out. If you start putting on harmonics by distorting things in a naive way without band limiting them, and there are clever ways of getting around this. But for instance, you can oversample, and there's other interesting things to do as well. But supposing what ends up happening is this stuff bounces off the Nyquist frequency. This is what aliasing is. You can put it on say Vox-Engo span. I've done this in a video. The video for, oh God, what's the name of that one? I did a special kind of band limited distortion that intentionally filtered off the high frequency stuff and then only saturated stuff where the harmonics would not go past this point. But what we start getting is and they start getting more finely spaced. So when they start reflecting back into the audio range again, you get this. You can see it in Vox-Engo span. If you take a simple sine wave, do a sine sweep, and have the sine sweep go from like low frequencies up to the Nyquist frequency, and set it up in span so that you can watch it go, and it'll go like weep. So here's the deal. This is what happens when you're doing simple, naive algorithms for distorting stuff. Like if you take a thing and say, you know, here's my waveform. And if it's louder than this, you write a program and it says, here's the waveform coming in. If it's louder than this or this, it is equal to this or this. And what you'll get is a naive square wavy thing, which I'm trying to draw with a little bit more boldness. And you get this waveform that in theory is more square wavy, and you're just clipping it to this point. So this is what the clips look like. And in theory, it's like going into analog, No, it's not. It was a different video. It was one of my more recent experiments. And I'm going to take half a moment and look it up because I can do that. I'll tell you the exact video that it is in, and for those who want to look it up later. It was, see, let me look through some of these things. It was before Holt, it was before Tape Fat. Unbox. I'll type that in. So that is the video to which I refer. And that's the one that handles this in a different way by trying to distort only. Basically what Unbox does is it takes this kind of thing, the input signal coming in, and just goes, okay, anything beyond this, just go away. And then it distorts it in this soft way that produces only a few harmonics on it, because if you make a really sharp edge, you start producing all of these additional harmonics going way out past where you normally would. But if you do a really soft, gentle algorithm, Unbox. If you do a really soft, gentle algorithm, then you're adding harmonics essentially one at a time. And in order for it to reflect backwards into the audio path again, the initial sound that you would make would have to be very high frequency, like up here. And if you have a harmonic or a raw signal that is close enough to the top limit of what you can record, you get to where you can't actually do any harmonics of any kind anymore. You can only do, say, let's see, if this is 44.1K and this is 0, and the harmonics are always start at twice the frequency, then the highest frequency that you can have that still has a harmonic to it is 10K, which is a pretty high frequency. But that is the highest note you can have that can produce even one harmonic and have it still contained within 44.1K sampling rate. Now, how this interacts with digital is like this. If you had a waveform and you were just clipping it in analog, it'll literally do this. It's producing harmonics that go way out past what the digital thing will handle and then get filtered off when you capture it into the digital audio again. And that's why saturations and things in analog tend to be pretty good. However, if you have digital, what you've got is these sample positions. And what you're doing is you're replacing those sample positions with other sample positions. But the sample positions are not themselves the audio. The sample positions are instructions for how to do the audio. And here's what happens when you have samples that do a nice smooth curve. The audio gets reconstructed to follow that nice smooth curve. Fairly well, anyhow. Now, the thing about clipping stuff like that is you start getting sample shape. This is another reason why it becomes a problem. You start getting stuff like this. It's taken the sample positions that were here and just switched them over until you've got essentially the same thing as, like, these are all the same and then these are all the same. But the reconstructed waveform cannot actually connect the dots. That's a caveat there. You can get digital to audio to analog converters that will disconnect the dots, but they're not considered to be proper reconstruction of the sound. There are limitations to doing stuff that way. But when you have the sequence of dots like this, and they're essentially just squared off like that. This is essentially digital distortion, but what is going to be produced is the waveform that would be represented by those sample positions. And what that becomes is this. There's an overshoot, and then there's a wiggle, because the way that it works is these are instructions for reconstructing the audio. These are where you make the audio go, and to reconstruct it usually involves overshooting certain things. Like if you had a series of samples and then just one that was way out of place, which you can get in some kind of symbols and things. If you reconstructed this waveform, it would not go up to that and then back down, because that would be a corner that was so sharp that it would be almost, this incredibly high frequency stuff if you were just literally making it go to that point. The corners being done by doing that are far too sharp. Essentially, this is the equivalent of high frequencies like up into the megahertz. They're radio frequencies in order to turn the corner that fast. Nothing can basically do that. So when you have a sequence of samples in digital audio, and then one that's way out of place, like that, you wind up wildly overshooting and then also undershooting, because this is the reconstruction of what those samples would mean. Like if you recorded the sound, that's where they'd put the sample. If you recorded that waveform and put it into digital form and filtered out all of the higher frequency stuff, you'd end up with this. And it would go beyond where the sample goes, and the sample would be placed there because that's how to make it do that in the output. However, when we are distorting things in the box and getting just a sequence of a line of samples as if that was the actual output, you produce these overshoots by the reconstruction filter. That is also known as intersample peaking, which is notable in mastering, because that's one of the concerns that you have, is that in mastering, you can master stuff using legal samples that are within the range that you can have on, say, a CD. And if you've just clipped a lot and you have really bright stuff, and I think in Whitesey's analysis of different mastering and pseudo-mastering things, where you went to the mastering engineer and then there were a couple of different online mastery things and stuff, what you get is, oh no, yeah, this is, ignore what's behind this curtain. I'm writing all of the nutty pictures today. One of the reasons you might go to a mastering engineer who knew what they were doing is because they would try to avoid generating stuff that would clip CD players. Because whether you're doing a CD player or whether you're making, say, MP3s and such, what you can end up with is a situation where, your maximum level is here, and then the overshoots are going here, and then the CD player or playback device is clipping and distorting those points, adding an additional layer of grunge that's not even contained within the audio. So basically, your playback device can be going along playing the digital audio, and then when it gets really loud and bright, all of a sudden it's throwing out this extra clippy noise that's beyond even digital audio. It's sudden bursts of high frequency stuff that aren't part of the recording. So that kind of stuff can get a little messy. And a digital recording, that's a very good question, Tourette's. A digital recording of this here we have our beautifully clipped analog that's straight up a raw square wave. That's going to look more like... Let me take a minute to make some of these be lovely and straight. You're going to have some intermediate spaces there, because these are there to tell you what the wave shape is going to be trying to do. So you'd have maybe several intermediate spots. And so you've got these points where it's trying to turn these corners, but it's designing the corner by these sample positions and placing them in such a way that the reconstructed waveform is going about as close to that corner as it can, but properly sampling something like this means that you're rounding them off. And let's imagine that this waveform is like 10 kilohertz. It's a square wave that's at 10K, and you're trying to do it in 44.1K sampling. You're going to have some really aggressively rounded off waveforms once you get through with it. Like any 10K square wave that you try to record into CD quality, it's going to do this, unless the converter is actually broken. And when you try to, nope, no give effect, instead, okay, well let's go to the fullest example. What do you get when you have literally a square wave that is at the Nyquist frequency? Any guesses? Here we've got this. Once the digital sampling gets a hold of it, you got a sine wave. It's just changed your square wave into a sine wave. There are no Gibb effect wiggles because there is no content. A square wave is made up of harmonics. It's a whole set of harmonics that are about equally loud, and they go up to radio frequencies depending upon how sharp this corner is. And interestingly, if you are doing analog amplifiers, because I'm not sure if anybody is into audiophilia. Whitesea might be a arch enemy of audiophilia for all I know, because there's certainly all of the weird wooden block things that you put in your speakers, or weird wooden block things that you put in a safe deposit box somewhere else in your house to make your audio sound better. And they're really into that kind of stuff. Ripping people off in audiophilia is a time-honored pursuit. And at the same time, audiophilia also has people who are willing to work really hard on little details in sound. And if you take your 10 kilohertz square wave and put it through certain analog amplifiers, what you might get is stuff kind of like this. There might be an additional tick on the edges of these things because the amplifier has band limits. A stereo amplifier isn't necessarily going to go up to radio frequencies. It might be kind of problematic. If it rolls off, it's going to round off the frequencies. You can have an analog amplifier turn stuff to this as well if it's just dull and it rolls off all the harmonics. Analog amplifiers are less likely to have a sharp multi-band filter. It's more likely to have a slower filter, so it would turn the square wave into sort of a rounded rectangle. But if you have an analog amplifier that rolls off at a certain point, perhaps to control high-frequency noise, and then has that in several stages to the point where it resonates, you'll get this. And there are audiophile magazines, notably Stereophile was always into this. And Absolute Sound was more into listening to stuff. Absolute Sound's interesting because Absolute Sound was also into being very wealthy people, listening to stuff and getting really high. So they wrote interesting reviews, let's just say. And it's rather inspiring if you have an artistic angle on building gear. That's the kind of stuff that is really entertaining because it's like, wow, they said that this amplifier was more juicy. What does that mean? And you listen to it and you could be like, just like with a guitar amplifier, oh, this guitar amplifier sounds a lot more juicy and this one sounds like harder and more crisp and stuff because the one is like all tube and band limited and rolled off, and the other one is transistor clipping. So they do end up sounding different. And indeed, a lot of the Audiophilia stereo stuff also uses tubes and has very similar qualities. Here's another one. You can have a stereo amplifier that has lots and lots of power, and its waveforms act like this. They go over to the positive, down to the negative, and in this tiny little area, it's switching from the one place to the other place so that there's this tiny discontinuity, and that is called Class B distortion. And then over to here, and then it does this, and then same place, it crosses over 0, it does Class B distortion because it's switching from side to side. It's doing a push-pull configuration. I have a plugin actually for doing that. It's called Single-Ended Triode. It can put that stuff in there for you. It sounds terrible. Then you can have another one, which is like, if you can guess what this would mean, this would be a Class AB distortion. Here is where you have two different things. There's an enormous amount of crossover between these. Normally they'd be much closer together. And in the central area for quiet little sounds, both of the energy carrying parts of the amplifier are biased to be in operation. So essentially what's happening here is this, both of the circuits are on. So for the quiet stuff, it does not have this that was characteristic of some transistor amplifiers. Notably, when they first started coming out, people were designing amplifiers like this. And they were going like, oh, this is a very tiny discontinuity, or this doesn't even exist because it should be perfect. And therefore, the idea was like, oh, there's no problem with that. Class AB biases the two stages into each other. So the one is kind of going from here to here, and then the other one is going from here to here, and they overlap. That's what Class AB is the overlap. And that means that in this middle part where quiet, subtle noises are happening, there is no crossover point. But you also have two amplifiers going at once. Then you've got Class A. No switching, no multiple sections, limited loudness, limited power that it can put out. Also, Class A has a tendency of, if you notice, this is slightly flatter. It'll run out of steam more quickly in one pole than the other, so it will generate asymmetrical distortion rather than symmetrical distortion. If you distorted the crap out of it, you could wind up with something that was very exaggeratedly distorted, and you could make it go louder in this direction but not in this direction. And that is the famous single-ended triode of incredibly expensive audiophile amplifiers that only have like 3 watts, and they have these giant tubes that are the size of like, my amplifier with this is a tube and it's pulling several hundred watts, and it's not producing much output. It's because it's doing this kind of thing. There's no transition point. Interestingly, Class D is kind of similar in that, looking for a new blank piece of paper. Class D, the digital form, is like this. These dots are at, say, 100 megahertz, and every single one of them is like, make it go more this way, or make it go more this way. That's what Class D is. Yeah, Western Electric 300B is a big old triode. But Class D is a digital form, and I use that for my own amplifiers, actually. My amplifiers were bought from Channel Islands. I've had them for ages. I know, right? And Channel Islands was one of the first people who were making, God, what they call them, hypexers. There is a particular module that you've got that does this for you, and then it's a matter of just surrounding it with power supplies and such. And Channel Islands were some of the first people to do this roughly 40, 60 watt amplifier based on this chip that required, your heatsink and your power supply and stuff. And they were making these amplifiers with big old toroidal power transformers to give it the power. So it's a combination of this module that you can get for fairly cheaply, and then ancillary equipment like the power supplies and stuff that are very expensive and fancy. So I use Class D amplifiers for my speakers and for monitoring through. And you can also get very cheap Class D that doesn't have fancy power supplies. But what Class D does is it is a digital format, but the sampling rate is extremely high. It's kind of similar to SACD, also known as DSD, Direct Stream Digital, except for that I think that Class D stuff is even higher frequency, but basically that's how it's working. It is modulating between a full power power supply source and full power negative power supply. So at any given moment, it's just vibrating between the two possible extremes. And if they average out to be about 0, it's going to end up being silence. And it's just going to chase what the input waveform is and modulate this 1-bit kind of thing. That's what 1-bit digital audio is about. The challenge with the 1-bit digital audio is you can't edit it, but with a amplifier, like a Class D amplifier, you don't need to edit it. It's just giving the more or less than based on the original waveform coming in. And I swear by that quite a lot, because it's certainly better than your Class D problems of push-pull, or Class AB of the middle part is fine, but then there's going to be a point where you transition over to the one or the other. And honestly, the Class AB stuff is more likely to be a smaller crossover point, because the bigger the crossover point, the more energy it's just wasting. Like, the overlap is the area where both of them are burning energy as fast as they can. And the more overlap, the more energy is wasted. Like the Class A amplifier like this, it's always like, here is your 0 energy burn point and here's your maximum. So if you're idling something like this at 0, it's constantly running all this energy through it, like half of the full amount that you need in order to drive at full crank. It's burning all the time. Class A is not an efficient way to power amplifiers. So yeah, there's some more pages consumed. So yeah, you can, but the thing about how many hertz would 100 samples at 44.1 kilohertz be, basically you need a calculator. The coherent sampling calculator sounds about right. I do have a calculator myself, so maybe I'll just try to figure that out for you 44.1. So 44,100, because kilohertz is 1,000. So 44,100, and then 100 of those is going to be, actually this is not hard. You're asking for 100 samples, so that's just divided by 100, because the more samples, the lower the rate is. 441 hertz. So 100 samples is kind of a mid-range frequency. It's amazing how digital audio handles high frequencies with so few samples to resolve them. And this is part of the reason why digital distortion winds up sounding the way that it does. I would say if White Sea is still here, it may very well be. New console runs in Class AB. Oh, I remember about that, yeah. I feel you. That's the kind of thing that I would want to rebuild myself, but then you also have to decide, like, how much energy am I going to put into doing the thing? You know, and is the thing that valuable? Sometimes you just have to make a choice as far as this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm not going to do, because you can't do everything. So here's what you do. You take a audio track and generate an audio track, or make your DAW do this, where you're generating a anti-aliased frequency like the sine wave. I know Logic can do this. I think probably anywhere you can get something that'll do this. So it's, you know, that is an exercise for the experimenter. Tell it to make the sine wave sweep upwards from whatever low frequency you want to the Nyquist frequency. And you'll have a sine wave that goes tweep. And as that goes up to the Nyquist frequency, you stop being able to hear it, because it's a anti-aliased frequency generation. It's doing a sine wave, and it's doing the sine wave in this clever way. Kind of like, what is my drawing? This is the drawing. It's doing a sine wave in this clever way where it's going to calculate out where the samples should go to be able to make the sine frequency, whether maybe they're being spaced out in funny places, but the idea is that it will end up spacing them in this way where the output is this lovely nice, here, let me get the smaller pen. What you want to do is have the computer generate a wave where it's spitting out all these funny frequencies, and the upshot of it is that it's going to generate a sine wave that is reconstructed to be exactly here. And the computer's able to do this just fine. It doesn't have a problem doing that. You tell, like, Logic's signal generator or anybody's signal generator, as long as it's band limited, generate me a sine wave that sweeps upwards to the Nyquist frequency. It's more than happy to do it. And it'll do that. It will give you this weird scattering of samples, and that will reconstruct a frequency that just, the output of it will be a sine wave that goes up to your Nyquist frequency and then stops. Then you take that and start distorting it. You put it through your digital distortion, your saturation. Anybody's, including mine. Mine still misbehave with this. Everybody's misbehaved with this. This is a really good sort of snake oily kind of thing to do. So there's your pro tip. Put the recording or the signal generator that would produce wonderful quality sine wave, you know, like that. Put the distortion after that, and then put say Vox Echo Span, your spectrum analyzer after that. And what you will see is the harmonics will keep scooching up until they hit that point, and you'll see the shape of, you might have a shape of harmonics where it's like, this is not very distorted, so it makes this harmonic and this, and then these are quieter, and they get quieter and quieter until they're lost in the bottom. You swoop this up, and the harmonics will move along with it. They will move up to where they hit this Nyquist frequency, and then they will bounce. They will reflect off of the top and be visibly seen going the other direction. You'll watch them bounce off the Nyquist frequency and go back down. And that is literally aliasing. You get to watch aliasing on the screen when you do this. And the more harmonics you have, the quicker you'll run into trouble with that. But by the same token, if you only have a sine wave or a bass frequency, like bass guitar or something like that, and you're only generating a few harmonics, it's quite possible to have digital saturation with no aliasing at all. Because the aliasing depends upon forcing the digital algorithm to generate these harmonics that are too high for the digital thing to handle. And one of the ways to deal with this, which I'll draw on yet another piece of paper, I'm going through all the paper today, here is something that you can do, or something that we program, plugin mongers can do. Say we've got a recording. Here's our Nyquist frequency. So what we're doing is we're going to take the input in and go, oh, hey, you're now 4 times oversampling. I'm going to take this input waveform and we're going to resample it to 4 times the sampling rate on the fly. Inside my plugin, it runs 192K, just does. So we're starting at, say, like 48K, and then twice that would be 96, and then twice that would be 192, and my plugin does this. Then you start taking a sample and generating harmonics, but you've resampled it so that we're getting the same effect that we would have if it was just a low frequency thing. And guess what? When we've resampled it to the high sample rate, and there are certain, look into Kazrog K-Clip is notable for being a well-executed version of this, where they could just, and it is also possible to run on a higher sample rate in general. If you've resampled so that your original 44.1K is 192, and note there is a caveat here. In some ways, you're going to get cleaner behavior with just resampling, but by the nature of audio in general, you can simply run at a higher sample rate, and there's going to be a lot of unused stuff way up at the top there. And that's fine. That's giving you space to have harmonics be there. If you do the resampling, and these are the harmonics that you generate, then you, at the output of your plugin, you go, you resample again. And now you've got a waveform that has, in theory, the same harmonics that you would have from just distorting it. But oh hey, we've resampled back down again, and so we're throwing away all the information that was here. And that is a way in which plugins like K-Clip, or there's a number of other plugins where you can just crunch lots of information. Like there's plugins that'll resample up to 384K or higher. You can more or less go about as high as you want, and it's not all that fancy or sophisticated. It's just they're just, indeed. All they're doing is resampling your input audio using decent sample rate conversion. And sample rate conversion is expensive, so it'll start killing your CPU if you have to do a lot of it. All they're doing is resampling up to a very high rate, and this is the only area that is actually being used. They're going to do the distortion. They're going to do the distortion in a naive way, like just straight up clipping or whatever. And then, having done that, they're going to sample back down again and obliterate all the higher frequency stuff. Now, note this. If you had such an intense square wave that you're generating harmonics that go right on past 192K, guess what? Same deal. It's still going to reflect, and know what? It's still going to reflect back into the audio path. It's not immunity to the issue of aliasing. Oversampling is only going to give you more space. Like if you oversample 2x, you get this much, and you can go a little bit past, but then if you start clipping so hard that your harmonics are just going out forever, it will reflect back into the audio range. And the initial part is going to be thrown away, but then you're still going to end up having some of this stuff. And the issue with this reflecting back is also this. This is one of the things that happens to digital audio. You got your initial harmonic, and then they start getting spaced out. And then it's like finer and finer spacing. You can see this when you distort things. And it goes up to the Nyquist frequency. And then as they reflect off of the Nyquist frequency and come back and become aliasing, these are no longer harmonically related to your audio. Instead, they're going to be scattered in places where it's like a ring modulator. You're going to have your nice harmonic thing. It's a waveform. It sounds like nice and sweet and stuff, and the harmonics are related to the fundamental tone. But then when you get into the aliasing, those reflections are never in tune with the note. They're sort of clashing sounds, and not only that, if the frequency of the sound wiggles a tiny bit, like it goes this direction maybe a little, then the aliasing is going to go the other direction very aggressively. So you'll have, and you can also hear this on synthesizers, like digital synthesizers. Not so much analog stuff, but more or less any digital synthesizer with a bright high frequency tone earlier than a certain era. If you play a high note and fool with the pitch bend or put some vibrato on it, it will break up in a very characteristic way. And what that is simply the naive generating of the waveform. It's producing these harmonics, and then if you nudge the pitch this way a little tiny bit, the aliasing will go the opposite direction for this intense ring modulatory, like broken glass kind of sound. And it's very distinct. It's very obvious. It's quite easy to tell if you're fooling around with that with say a sine wave in a DAW or whatever. Anytime you do that, if you do the sine wave sweep and the sine wave sweep goes up to the Nyquist frequency, it'll be fairly easy to find out whether you're giving plugins fits. Because the thing about it is people normally demonstrate these things, and I'm no exception, with audio content. I can demonstrate a distortion plugin and throw it on, say, a bass, or throw it on a sine wave or something like that, and you'll hear it sort of warmly add a little saturation. This is the same, it's very much the same thing with the one that I just put out, which is Deckreka, where that generates a lot of low frequency stuff. It's not exactly the same algorithm. I'll show you the Deckreka algorithm, actually. This is what underlies 2-tape 5. And the Deckreka algorithm, which is similar to 2-tape 5, is we've got a waveform, and then imagine we've got this weight swinging on the end of the waveform. So the waveform goes up, And the weight's like, nah. It'll just start swinging in this direction. It's swinging after the waveform. But the waveform is being pushed back by its closeness to the top. So it can keep swinging this way. And then the amount that it's getting pushed back is relative to how close it is to the top. Like it gets a lot closer, and the gravity force that's pushing it back, it's like a physics engine, is much stronger. So what you wind up getting is this scenario where you can't actually make it go too close to here. But in the center, it can kind of swing back and forth with very little resistance. So small amounts of energy predominating up here will tend to make it swing over this way and then gradually run out of steam and balance out somewhere. It's essentially throwing a physics engine onto the audio and having the low frequencies, whether it be a head bump or what Decreca is doing. Decreca does some things with randomness as well, but it's basically taking a physics engine and using that to synthesize this heavy, overblown bass. And the amount of bass that you can get out of it is limited to where it is in the waveform, so it'll try to be centered. But at the center, it's more free of wandering. And at any of the extremes, it's more capable of swinging back rather than sort of swinging forth. And that is how the two-tape engine works, and that is how Decreca, or at least part of Decreca, works, because it's also got a variety of other stuff going on as well. So yeah, the last question that I was asked is, it is indeed possible to run in a higher sample rate in general. And what helps you there is the fact that you've got a lot of headroom in terms of the frequencies that you're using. Like our problem with the aliasing here, of having stuff contained within this bandwidth, this is in theory what you can hear. And so in theory, this area over here, oh, you can't hear it, so it doesn't matter. But when you're dealing with stuff in digital forms, that area, if you were able to generate stuff like that in the box, and you had a higher sample rate, so that you're running at a higher sample rate, and you're generating some of these harmonics, they can be generated up here and not cause any problems until you reach the sample rate and then reflect back. And then there's still the capacity of reflecting back into the audio waveband. And this reflecting that you see drawn here is part of what's causing digital plugins to sound flat. That's part of what's doing it. Analog generated sources don't always have to produce these inharmonic things, these sounds that are not related to the waveform. They're just filling up, whether it be quantization. And I've done a whole thing about how, in fact, now that I've got White C here, I invented a way of doing floating point dithering some time back. And if you were to do a snake oil video on whether you could hear the effects of dithering to floating point, you would find that you cannot hear the effects of dithering to floating point. I'm doing it because it's correct. It's a technical exercise. And I feel that in general, if you run enough plugins, eventually it will add up. But it's more just the general concept, kind of like with here, about when you're having your digital audio. Oh, here's a better example. When you got your digital audio and it's producing these harmonics and these things, anything that you generate as far as this garbage down here that is not related to the audio is not your friend. And digital produces a lot of that. Like take the suggestion of taking a sine wave and sweeping it up to the Nyquist frequency, run it into anybody's distortions, console emulations, any of that stuff. I don't care whose it is, mine included. Anybody's stuff. Start running these sine wave frequencies and have the sine sweeping up to Nyquist, and almost anybody's plugins will just fall down in a big pile of splat. It'll generate horrible, grungy noises. And, oh, by all means, you're welcome to do that. I have had big fights with people on the internet over the floating point dithering. You're quite welcome. Only thing you can't say that I'm telling people that they can hear it, because I've been telling people this entire time that they cannot. Not in a single stage. And it's like the idea of just being really thorough. Because here's the thing. I found that I could hear more stuff having to do with really dithering to really low, like dithering to stuff like 24-bit. That's tough to measure even. But what I found, it was more satisfying in a way that couldn't really be easily identified. My theory on that basis is that our hearing is not a off or on again kind of thing. Instead, you can sort of hear into stuff, and it becomes more and more fugitive the deeper you hear into it. So there will be this individual instance, just these moments where you're briefly hearing way below where you should be able to. And then if something is wrong there, you register it, but then you can't pin it down. Our ears are just not regular enough. So the whole snake oil concept sometimes is based on this idea that, like, oh, well, our hearing is completely consistent. Oh, no, Grasshopper, it is not. Our hearing is very sketchy, and sometimes you'll be inspired by some kind of sound. EBS, you can ask anything about it, yo. You've got 3 minutes. My idea with the digital audio stuff is anytime stuff reflects into aliasing, anytime stuff generates just quantization noise down here, for instance, all of these things are undesirable and wrong. And they are the reason that digital audio sounds flat, because we're getting like grunge and obnoxiousness at incredibly, incredibly faint levels. It just builds up and it distracts, or it causes like quantization in particular, but then very definitely aliasing because of the ring modulatory kind of effect. They generate artifacts that sound actively unpleasant. It's better to have them generate sounds that are basically noise. And that, of course, is what dither is about. But when you don't have these fixes to the digital problems, you get these incredibly low level. Like you have very faint aliasing, but it's doing this. You have very faint quantization, but it's doing that. They're related to the waveforms, and they're messing the waveforms up in characteristically bad ways. So I basically just consider that there is no level which I accept those problems at. Like, I don't do much about aliasing. I rely on the fact that if you have lower frequency sounds, then harmonics that you generate, if you're really aggressive generating harmonics, it'll produce aliasing pretty much no matter what. But if you do stuff that's fairly gentle, like compressors that don't have instantaneous attacks, clippers that don't have like complete raw digital clipping, if stuff has gentler curves on it, it doesn't generate harmonics up that high. And when there are harmonics that are not generated beyond Nyquist, there's no aliasing. If you're not generating a harmonic above Nyquist, you do not have aliasing. So it's all a matter of degree, really. It's a matter of, are the digital processes that you're using generating the problem in the first place? And that is kind of why, when I did Unbox as the sort of tech experiment about like, let's distort only the mid-range, and then let's not even worry about, we'll take the high frequencies, we'll filter them off, we'll do the distortion, and then we'll put the high frequencies back so you still have them. That is a very effective way to not have aliasing. It's just not clipping the high frequencies at all. It's ignoring them. And that's one of the possible ways of doing it. High That's an interesting question from EB. And I would say, yeah, high cut, which is also known as low pass, it's a low pass filter, is very often a good idea. And I'll tell you why. When you're doing waveforms, when you're doing like audio, and say, I'm not sure if I need to use paper for this one. Say this is my apparently rude gesture, but this is also my microphone. Oh, I've been all over that topic. We're going to go a little over time to talk about Soothe with you, because I got White Sea with me as well, and this is another person interested in that kind of thing. I'll explain exactly what it does. If you have a microphone here, the sounds picked up by the microphone are going to have very high frequency sounds. If you have a microphone here, and you have the same things, and you amplify the microphone until it's the same gain, the frequency balance is not going to be the same as when it was here. Because when you're here, there's like half an inch of airspace to go through. When you're over here, there's a couple of feet of airspace to go through. And when sound goes through air, the high frequencies go away. Air does low pass. We know this because if you were out in a thunderstorm and listened to the thunder, all of that thunder was originally an enormous high frequency sound. A stroke of lightning splitting the air is a very rapid noise, and it is a very high frequency noise. It starts turning into low frequencies. I have no idea what that meant, but cool. That's a really big wow, okay. Must be a tip or something. I guess YouTube lets you do. Nobody has ever done that, White Sea. Thank you so much. If you have enough distance between you and the lightning, you get thunder, and thunder is the high frequencies being rolled off by passing through air. It's the same if you listen to a space shuttle takeoff or something like that. Any rocket takeoff. If you're enough far away, you're getting low frequency stuff and a lot of really weird atmospheric effects that can happen. So if you are trying to produce a sound in your mix that sounds like it's at a distance, you're going to need to do high cut. You're going to need to do low pass, equalization, roll the high frequencies off. And that's one of the things I like to do with reverbs. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I like some of the older digital reverbs. Like, I'm a big fan of my original MIDI verb, and I'm thinking about maybe picking up some MIDI verb 2s, which can actually go into a rack and have more. The original MIDI verb has RCA jacks. That's the kind I'm using. But both of these are old school primitive digital. They have some interesting qualities, such as the all-pass filters in those old reverbs use amplification factors of exactly increments of 0.5 or 2 times or whatever, because they have essentially all of their internal gain controls are bit shift gain. Didn't catch me that time. If anybody's wondering why I joke about that, it's because if I say that plug-in too quickly, then YouTube thinks I said a naughty, naughty word. Anyways, these old digital reverbs are run at sample rates that are really very low. So the it's rack mountable. MIDI verb 1 can't even be fit into a rack. They don't have the bandwidth. They don't have the sample rate. Everything that you get out of them is going to be rolled off. You can't make high frequencies go through them. And this contributes to them sounding like they're coming from a distance. And reverb is supposed to sound like it's coming from a distance. So it just basically all works out. And I'm a big fan of those. There's no reason you can't also do it. In fact, I've got some plug-in reverbs. They're okay. I fairly recently did that one that was MV. MV is like MIDI Verb 2's Bloom control. And I came up with some ways of averaging stuff out inside it so that it would do a distant type effect as well. But yeah, the high cut is useful anytime you don't want everything to sound as if it's on the surface of your eardrum. That's one of the problems with digital recording, in fact, is that DAWs, by nature, if you're recording stuff into them and mixing through them without doing something funky like console or whatever, they'll give you literally and exactly what you put in, with no roll-off, no change of any kind. It's just perfectly mathematical. And so what that can sound like is every single element in the mix on the surface of your eardrum, and just kind of all existing in the same space, which is not realistic, and it's not how air behaves. So it winds up sounding kind of artificial. And that's just inherent to how the DAW works. So with that, we have reached 1 o'clock and gone a little bit beyond. So what I'm going to say is, since I haven't gotten to the goal, I'm not doing a Wednesday live stream yet. That's probably going to happen before too many months go by. But it's not happened yet. So instead, I will catch you folks, say, next week. Same bad time, same bad channel. Thank you again, White Sea. I'm going to have to find out how that even worked. It's like, maybe you just gave money to Google in doing that, and I don't see any of it. Or maybe you boosted up my largely insignificant Google AdSense revenue, which doesn't really matter to anybody or anything. And then I'll be able to get a payout because it's been about a year. I probably earned another $100 or so. But we shall see. And again, you were the first person ever to use that feature. It's some kind of YouTube feature where you're supposed to throw money at the people. And I guess I allowed it to be turned on, but I didn't expect anybody actually to use it. So thank you, sir. And again, drop by anytime. I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. That's kind of what I do. And if you want to set up some kind of collaboration streamy thing, which would probably be... No, well, honestly, it's starting to get warm enough where I'm going to need to... I'll probably get some nice shirts and pants and stuff, and it'll be like the classy version of wearing PJs or whatever. Just something that'll be comfortable to wear. It would look a little bit like the Airwindows streams, but I wouldn't have to care too much about taking care of the shirt. I could spill coffee on it and it'd be fine. Quick answer, because the way that works, Chris, is it's cold in here. And it's getting to be summer, so it's not cold in here any longer. And I have not got the new improved DS yet. That is going to end up happening. It's on the list, and might be something where I have to get a little more sophisticated with the programming, because what I'm attempting to do with it is a little more complicated. I need to make sure that it works properly, and I need to execute it in the way that I intend. And it's probably the kind of thing where if I did it more sophisticated, and then basically if you wanted a really sharp cutoff, it would just start chewing up all the CPU. I can probably make it do that, and then people who really wanted that behavior would, White Sea is actually pretty good. It's be careful with telling people to get educated, because they can start going to these resources that don't know what they're talking about, and that's dangerous. You got to make your own decisions. That's the great thing about White Sea, is he's making his own decisions about things. And no, I didn't get to talking about Soothe. I'm going to have to, it's 1:10, but I did say that I was going to mention that. Before I log off, here's the thing about Soothe is it is doing something that I don't think should be done. Soothe analyzes the waveform, kind of like your spectrum analyzer. It may do it in a different way, I'm not sure. Probably the easiest way to do it would be with an FFT spectrum analyzer. And it analyzes when there is a spike that is way above everything else, namely a resonance. And Soothe kind of decides like, oh, okay, anytime you have a resonance, that's bad. It should be turned down. Possibly because it's like, well, we can turn everything up louder if the resonances are turned down. Possibly because, oh, resonances only happen when you have like comb filtering or something. But there's a lot of useful sound that's loaded with extremely high resonance. Like acid, imagine listening to acid house music or rave music with incredibly sharp filter squelches and then throwing Soothe on it. It would kill the whole thing. There's entire genres that are based on having big spikes of resonance swooping around and doing interesting things. There is like classical music recordings where there are particular notes that are known to be splendid and wonderful. Like, oh, this particular record that they have back in the 1950s, recorded through tube equipment and etc., where the trumpet hits this note and the note, oh, it goes right through you. It's amazing. And you're just like, that's resonance. That's resonance. When you hit a note that has a special sonority, when the note makes the hair stand up in the back of your neck, you're like, that's typically resonance. And if you neatly take the resonance out, you're taking that quality out and making it be bland, ordinary, and boring, and sound like a uninspired performance. You can have, say, to get into the stuff that I would be talking about on Wednesdays when I do the analysis videos of classic albums and play little bursts of them, I could say play things like, I don't know, Living Loving Maid off of the Led Zeppelin II album, I think is a good example of this. Often I'll be able to tell by listening. There were times when Jimmy Page and the classic Led Zeppelin albums, I think this is also the case in Presence in several cases, he set up multiple microphones. He set up multiple microphones where you'd have the main guitar mic, and then you'd have another guitar mic, and it was on the back of the cab. And they were both in phase, but the cab is going into opposite directions. And so he intentionally belabored his guitar tone with this huge, massive comb filtering, just this enormous resonance. And what it does is it makes the guitar get out of the way of other things in the mix so that other sounds can be bigger. And it has this very striking quality that you can hear that just, it stands out. You can still hear what all the notes are. It grabs your ear in this interesting way, and it's all being done through resonance and comb filtering and the ability to project certain harmonics and then ignore other harmonics, just have them cancel out. So, I put out the plugin ResiQ. ResiQ is nothing but a bank of resonators. And it's literally the opposite of Soothe. And I went, here, try this. If you're so concerned about taking away resonances, here, have something that does nothing but produce resonances. And then construct your sound out of a bank of those and see how that grabs you. And it went over fairly well. So the whole thing about Soothe is, on the one hand, it is a way for people who aren't in control of their recording or are being confronted by something where it's like, oh, hey, this microphone has a tinny ringing in its sound that's undesirable, which, that I don't like. Or I've recorded my recording and there's this desk here. And so in my voice recording, there is this one resonance that I don't like because it's being reinforced in an ugly place and sounds bad. And Soothe is going to identify stuff like that and take it out and my take on that is you should not be generating stuff that you don't like in the first place, much less generating stuff that you don't like in the first place and then using the computer plugin to take it out without really understanding what was causing the problem in the first place. So that's my take on Soothe. Is I feel like that is, like Apple loops and Logic, where it's filling a role. There's a place for that, but I simply don't like what it's doing. I don't like notably, there are things in audio that I absolutely love that Soothe exists to take away. And, for that reason, I'm real down on it. And it's like, okay, that's fine. I don't have to be a big fan of it. But that's the reason I'm so harsh, is because there's this approach that it exists because the thing that it does is always a problem and undesirable and should just typically be fixed. It's like, put Soothe on every track of your mix and everything is going to be great. Well, no, your mix is going to become a blurry mess because nothing is going to stand out and nothing is going to be able to speak up. It's like, you could use something like that on, say, drums. Or you could take it and throw it on some kind of drum which is honking at a particular frequency. And for drums, you're much more likely to want stuff to be just flat across the board and hit very evenly. So it could be super useful for something like that, but it's just not a general purpose use on everything kind of thing. And when people bring up that or ask me to do a version of it, it feels like they're doing that because they think it is a general purpose, fix everything kind of solution. So there you have it. That is my take on Soothe, which I think is fine for its place, but I think it's way overused and should not be leaned on in the way that I think it is often leaned on. And I'm going to go and make another cup of coffee and go about my day. So with that, we'll talk to you guys later. And drop by anytime, Whitesea. This has been fun. Talk to you guys later.